Do I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
Do I have a second? Second. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, the agenda's been approved. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting?
So moved.
Do I have a second? Second by Paul. Any discussion on the minutes? All right, seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, the minutes have been unanimously approved. Moving on to our first open issue, financial update from Ms. MacArthur. We have a couple items on our agenda here tonight. We're going to go over the finance update is January, so usually the second part of the year is our budget kickoff, and we work on the budget for the next few months until the end of the year when that's adopted in June. And so we're going to look at our preliminary numbers, where we ended our 22-23 fiscal year, and what we're looking at for our projected actuals for the 23-24 fiscal year, and our main revenue source and some property tax, our final numbers hot off the presses from the county clerk last night at 8:30 p.m. So our operating funds, again, a reminder to those, our operating funds includes our general fund and our teachers fund, and we refer to those two funds together as our operating funds. We ended up the 22-23 actual numbers, and this agrees to our audited financial statements that we received last month, with our total fund balance at $110,410,000. And again, that's slightly higher than what we had originally anticipated in our budget document. Our expenditures were right on target, less than $100,000 different from what we had in our projected actuals, but our revenues were slightly higher due to the supplemental appropriation of our sales tax that we received. If you recall, the auditors had said that we had a late adjusting entry last on our audit because of sales tax revenue that came in late. So that's also an adjustment that was made between our projected actual revenues and our what we're saying, where we finally ended up in our final actual numbers for the FY23 fiscal year. And we also we all know our interest rates are up, and so our interest revenue also was higher than what we had originally anticipated. And so those are the main differences that we saw between what we had in our projected actual numbers that were in the budget document and then where we actually ended up at the end of the fiscal year in our financial statements. And so 23-24, and that's the current fiscal year that we're in, again, for our operating funds. You can see there we are starting out with that $110 million in our fund balance for our beginning fund balance for July 1, 2023. And our revenue numbers, again, slightly higher than what we had originally anticipated in our 23-24 budget document. Again, and what we're going to talk about later tonight, we have an additional $5 million that's in that number. That's from our property taxes because our assessed valuation did come in higher than what we originally anticipated, and we'll see those exact numbers in a couple slides. We knew our preliminary numbers were up based on our tax rate and the information that we received back in July and August when we set our tax rate, but our final numbers did come in even higher than our preliminary numbers, and so we have some additional revenue in that line as well. So right now we're anticipating that we'll end the year with a fund balance of $116.9 million in our operating funds. Switching gears just a moment for our debt service fund. Again, the revenues are higher in our debt service fund as well. Remember, when we set our tax rate, part of our property taxes also go into our debt service fund. And so we have our revenues are about $1 million higher in debt service for our 23-24 because of that as well. And also for last year, first for 22-23 actual, we had some additional, again, interest revenue on our debt service funds. And so that's as we're going to go out for additional borrowing here as we issue the additional $40 million that's already been authorized by our voters. It puts us in a good position in our debt service fund for the repayment on the principal and interest on that debt. And so our ending fund balance, what we're anticipating right now for June 30th, 2024 in debt service is right under $33 million for a debt service fund. And then our capital projects fund.
Heather, we're issuing the second $40 million during this summer.
Actually, that was a nice segue, thank you. So for our 23-24, if you look at our capital projects fund, this is what our numbers look like, that $54 million there. $40 million of that number is based for the second issuance of our $40 million. And next month at Long Range Facilities, we're going to talk about our financial advisor will be here, and then the board will make a resolution, hopefully, to issue that second $40 million. The resolution will go to the board in February, currently is what we're anticipating, with a final sale in March. And we usually like to do that if the money is already authorized. We try to get ahead of all the new elections that may go in April, because there's usually the pricing and the interest rates are more competitive if you can be ahead of those bond sales after the April elections and the market's more saturated. And so we're going to try and get the resolution on the board agenda for February, and then with a final sale closing prior to the end of March for that second $40 million. And again, you can see our capital projects, we talked about this earlier too, all of that money from both of the that full $80 million is allocated to those projects. So we have our three main projects, our Career Center addition, our Ballo Elementary addition, and the new Southwest Elementary School that basically accounts for that full $80 million, as well as our final secured vestibule projects that are ongoing at our schools. And so that, again, that full $80 million has already been allocated. So our fund balance there, less than $40,000. Again, some of those projects will roll to year to year, but we do budget for the full amount of the projects in the current year to make sure that we're not overextending. And then once we have the final, like where we end the current year, then we'll roll forward those balances to the following year. We do have some recurring local property tax revenue that goes into our capital projects. The 1 cent that goes to our capital projects from our operating levy does go in there, but it accounts for about $3 million a year, as you'll see on the next slide, that goes into the capital projects. That's what we call local revenue that does account for projects recurring, but the main source of most of that revenue that's going into the capital projects fund is that bond money, as well as the remaining ESSER funds that we have, some ESSER 3 funds that are accounting for those HVAC projects that are ongoing in this current fiscal year as well. Again, all that federal money is on a reimbursement basis, so as we spend those monies and finish those projects, then we draw down that money from the federal government, and so that's about $10 million that's in that $54 million as well. And so here's our assessed valuation, and so this is the newest information that we have. You can see there what our budgeted amount was on the far right-hand column, and then we have our preliminary numbers that we received back in July from the county clerk's office, and then our final 23-24 assessed valuation numbers in the middle column there in the center of your page. And you can see that the real estate number is the number, the first three, we have the breakdown between residential, agricultural, and commercial real estate. And so our real estate number between our preliminary number and our final actual numbers for assessed valuation actually went down slightly. And so the increase overall between the preliminary and final is all in that personal property line. And you can see that line's kind of bolded there in the center of your screen. Our personal property went up to about $660 million to $696 million. And so that's what's driving that increase in our overall assessed valuation between the preliminary numbers and the final numbers. And that is typical that we do see the personal property line as people pay and stuff that trickles in late during the year. The main source of that, usually between our preliminary and final numbers, that is where the fluctuation occurs. And so you can see the increase over the prior year. There is right over $200 million from the prior year assessed valuation, and that percentage then equates to 6.64% increase. We had budgeted a 3% increase, and it was a reassessment year, and so we knew when the real estate, mainly those reassessments had come in July, that was over what we had originally budgeted. It was about $3 million over in our operating fund, and so we were able to rebudget that. But with the final numbers, that's about that additional 1% equates to about $2 million in revenue. And so the difference between the revenue and the budget and the current projections in the operating fund is $5,028,000. You can see down there on the bottom of the screen. And in the breakdown of the revenue by fund, you can see here the general fund and the teachers fund, again, are the two funds that we refer together as our operating fund. And you can, the difference column is, again, the difference between the budget and the final. And so those top two lines added together is that $5 million number that we were looking at, between the difference between the general and teachers fund preliminary budget and what our final assessed valuation numbers. And debt service, again, we said was about $1 million and higher in our revenues between budget and actual, what we're projecting at this point, and right over $100,000 in capital projects. So the total between all four funds, the difference is $6.1 million. And so the big question then is, how does this affect our 5-year model and what we're looking at our projections going forward? And so this will be the first look at our 5-year model as we work with a 5-year rolling model. Again, we don't want to just budget for 1 year into the future. We want to see how that's going to affect our fund balance 5 years into the future. So when we're making budget decisions for next year, we can make sure that's sustainable over the future 5-year plan. And so this is a first look at our 5-year model as we start budget season. You can see there the 23-24, and those numbers there should agree to that first slide that we saw at the beginning of the presentation. The $110 million is where we're starting out the current fiscal year. So that's our baseline amount in our fund balance. And then we're going to have a fund balance that is projected at June 30 for our operating funds of $116 million, and that is an increase in our fund balance of about $6.5 million. And so that's putting an additional $6.5 million into revenue going forward for the next 5 years. And so how we've allocated, we talked about an additional $3 million into employee compensation. So we're able to, from what was in the original budget for 23-24 and what we're going to look at for 24-25 and beyond, we had $2.5 million allocated next year for employee compensation, and so basically we're going to be able to double that amount for next year to be able to put into employee compensation for salary schedules for all of our employees. And $2 million, how that equates to some just things that I referenced, like if you wanted to put $1,000 on the teacher's salary schedule, that costs $2 million. And so so our current base teacher salary is $40,900. So basically to increase that $40,900 to $41,900, it would take $2 million. And so $2 million in additional revenue, that's basically an additional $1,000 that we can put into on the base for salary schedules.
In the projections of expenditures, how does employee benefits, how do y'all factor that in? Do y'all just use the rate that we pay now, or how do you look at those increases?
Yeah, so in the 5-year model, this is our second year of a 3-year contract that we have for independent, so there's no increases in rates for our premiums will be flat for those 3 years based on the contracts that we have locked in with UMR for our medical insurance and Delta Dental for our dental insurance and Express Scripts for our pharmacy. And so through the end of this 2024, I guess this is our second calendar year. So those are all on a calendar year basis, 23, 24, and 25. And so there's not any additional rate increases for insurance until 2026. And so that would be for the halfway through the 25-26 school year. And so I have a partial increase for that year, and then increases in the 26-27 and 27-28 fiscal years built into the 5-year model for benefit increases. And then also,
So we're coming off a 5.5%, 6% assessed valuation increase. What's your assumption in the out years?
So right now, conservatively, we're assuming a 3% increase for assessed valuation. This was a reassessment year, and so it was higher than what the previous year. The driver of our assessed valuation increase was because of the personal property line. It wasn't because of the real estate line. It was because of the 25% increase in personal property values, because of the used car market and those, sales like that over in previous years. So we don't want to really count on something like that happening, going forward. And that was kind of an anomaly that year.
So, just the observation doesn't change anything you're suggesting that, I mean, in the past, when we see outsized years of increases in assessed valuation, that tends to be like front loading, and they tend to be followed by years that are then under what you're expecting because it all evens out in the end. And so, yeah, I'm glad to hear it's only 3%, but it wouldn't be surprising to me within the next couple of years if it's below 3%.
Right. Yes, so that's something that we want to consider as well. And so when we talk about our budget parameters and budget priorities coming up to what kind of revenue do we have, basically we always want to start with our revenue numbers. What are our total revenue numbers? Then to work off, what kind of, increases in expenditures we do want to work within those parameters. And so conservatively moving into the future for next year is not an reassessment year, so we have a 3% ongoing. If you look at the past 5 years or 10 years, we don't, beyond a couple of like last year when we had an anomaly with the personal property tax, the non-reassessment years have been, that 3% or lower even for those non-reassessment years.
What is what is the philosophy behind the fund balance? Is it requirements via some reasoning or logic, or is that just something that's set by the school district?
So yes, both. There is not a set statewide limit or minimum, I guess, for fund balance, but because Columbia is heavily locally funded, as we were talking about our property taxes, we receive the majority of our revenue. Over 50% of our revenue does come directly from property taxes, so we don't receive that money until December and January of each year. And so in our comprehensive school improvement plan, actually and goal number 1 is that we have a minimum of 3 months fund balance on hand in our 5-year model, and so we want to make sure that we're above the 3 months in fund balance because that gets us, we do have some state and other money that comes throughout the fall, but the main source of our revenue to be able, and we don't want to have to resort to any kind of short-term borrowing in the fall from July 1 until December when we get those large property tax revenue payments to be able to get through that time period to be able to make payroll and pay our bills throughout that.
So what we're really seeing is a timing issue. For those that wouldn't be educated, I'd hate to see them look at this and go, $100 million just sitting around doing nothing. The reality is that you've received the vast majority of the revenues you're spending down through the calendar year.
Correct.
And
Correct.
Can I answer that in a way from someone that's not on the board or an employee? I think there's a strategy, like in a growing district where, your expenditures are going up, you're building schools, et cetera, and you don't want to go to the taxpayers for a tax increase every other year. So strategically, you want to go X number of years without having to do that. So to make that work, in essence, you're getting more revenue up front than you need in that year, and you're putting that aside in the reserves, knowing that you're going to spend it down as your expenditures keep going up, but your revenues are kind of flatlining. So unfortunately, the visibility of that is that it looks like you're building up these really big reserve balances, but it's really a thoughtful strategy that's just saying we don't want to go to the taxpayers every other year and ask for a tax increase.
I think it's important to state because you often see the biggest thing you see in the newspapers and things like that about public entities, utilities, school districts, and so forth is they have $100 million. Well, it's not necessarily true and never is true. So understanding the cycle and the funding, the expenses is pretty difficult for most people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And not all school districts are the same. A lot of local, smaller districts get a lot of their majority of their revenue comes from the state. So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of philosophy either. So some districts might not have to have 3 months because if they get more of their money from the state and less money from local property taxes, it wouldn't be, like the same that within every school district. But especially in a school district like Columbia, that's a larger school district that gets the majority of their money from property taxes, it's really important that you have that 3 months of fund balance on hand. So because you don't want to then run out of money in the fall and then have to go borrow money and pay additional interest or whatever to be able to pay bills between July and December when you get that money.
Heather,
And yeah, go ahead.
part of that, as you're saying, because of the difference between local and state, but it's because the state pays on a monthly basis.
Correct.
Of their funds that they have to give to school districts. I wanted to make sure that was correct.
Yeah, and so our state, so those of you, our state, we receive about 30% of our total operating revenue from state sources, and so that largely funded by the basic formula or the state foundation formula funding, and so that money does come through what we get from our Department of Elementary and Secondary Education through our DESE payment each month, and so that some of that does come in each month, but also the large majority then that comes from local revenue we don't receive until that halfway through the year. December and January we get the bulk majority, like now Jim is busy investing all that money that comes in, and that has to sit there, that gets us through the next calendar year. And you can see, as we're talking about, long-term sustainability is important, and so we don't want to spend, as we know we have an additional $5 million, but we don't want to spend all of that money or all of the fund balance, the additional money in the 1 year. We want to make sure that's sustained. But it is recurring revenue, so it's not like a one-time expense that you don't want to ever match up recurring expenditures against a one-time revenue source. The assessed valuation is a recurring, property taxes is a recurring revenue that's going to recur every year.
So that's my question, and I think everybody's brought up really good questions about the fund balance, because I know that's a funky thing for a lot of people. I sound like a robot. And Blake has brought up good points and stuff before about it. Having that is good, because then we haven't had to let people go. We've had that money when those revenues and things aren't there. So it's a good thing to have the fund balance. I guess my question about the fund balance is, in those years, so right now, the end of next year, we're expecting 116 or whatever it was, $216 million or $116 million in the fund balance. What could we do with any overage that we have? If it ends up being 120 million, we've effectively got $4 million just sitting there. I know we cannot use it for recurring expenses, but is it possible to use that money for outfitting half of the playgrounds for elementary schools with new equipment? Is it possible to use it to put all new equipment in the science classrooms in the middle schools or the high schools? Could we use that extra, that overage, for those one-time, non-recurring things?
Yes, so similar to what we have done with some of our ESSER funding and those one-time revenues, transfers to capital and capital projects, like you saw our capital fund balance, really all the money that we have coming into capital projects is basically allocated for projects that are already in progress. And so any large capital purchases, like you said, like we did a lot of the HVAC work with our ESSER funding, any other kind of large, we have a lot of deferred maintenance that is not being addressed, so large projects that you could transfer to capital and address some of deferred maintenance needs, those type things that are really one-time spends, you could absolutely make a transfer from the operating fund to the capital project.
So would that have to be a board level
And so
decision?
that would have to be anything that's transferring money between funds would have to be approved by the board, correct? And one other thing I wanted to point out, as you do, we do have a increase in our fund balance, and so I have reallocated that because we know student achievement is important, recruiting and retaining. We have a national teacher shortage like we've never seen before, and so continuing to put money into not only teacher compensation but our hourly employee compensation, trying to keep those hourly positions filled. Like we know our non-certified positions over the last 3 to 4 years since COVID really are the positions that we're seeing openings in as well. And so we want to make sure that we're continuing to put money into those salary schedules as well. And so, again, there is an increase over what we had originally said would be in 24-25. We had $2.5 million allocated. Well, now it's 4.5. And so that's built into this current 5-year model that you see on the screen today. And then beyond that, in 25-26, we had $1 million in the 23-24 budget, and that has been increased to $3 million. And so basically that money then has been bumped out in the future years so that we have a stair step where we can put additional money into those salary schedules over the next 3 years that was not originally allocated in the current 23-24 budget. Some other assumptions that I've assumed, we all know that federal money is running out this year, so we're absorbing all the ESSER-funded positions. Our instructional mentors is about $850,000 of that. We know as we've worked with Nate Levinson and some of our consultants that how important it is to train up our teachers, especially our new teachers, and so we have those support for our classroom teachers. So those positions have been absorbed into our district operating budget, and we have a couple counseling positions and some other intervention positions that have been absorbed in the 24-25 school year and beyond that are going to be paid with local funds after that federal money runs out.
And Heather, I wanted to add, as you look at fund balance, look at projections, also remember we have a new school coming online, and that's going to require staffing, bringing in entire new staff, new administration, new everything. So again, being prepared for that is also being very helpful by having the money, fund balance for that.
You can see between the 24-25 and 25-26 school years, the expenditures jump quite a bit. Not only is that additional money into salaries, goes from 277 to 289. So that's where Dr. Yearwood was talking about in the 25-26. We have some one-time expenditures for furniture, fixtures, and equipment for our new school as it's being built. And then also those additional positions that go into the new school building in 26-27 with the fall opening projected now at the Southwest Elementary School in the fall of 2026. We have all the positions. We know like some of the teaching positions will come from other schools, but you're going to have a new principal, assistant principal, secretaries, custodians, all those type positions that will go into that. And all that's, we have the reorganization for the new school and the opening of the new school. Those amounts are built into this model as well.
Thank you for bringing that up because I was going to also bring it up because one thing too is we were expecting the new Southwest Elementary School and the Battle Addition to be done sooner, but because of supply chain delays and things of that nature, we've been letting the public know that we've been having pushed that back. So that's also in some way, would you agree, Heather, with this, or you could disagree, let me know if I'm wrong here, is that some of this fund balance increase too is due to the fact that we were expecting to spend it sooner than what we're now having to.
Yeah, and you can see also between 24-25, that the jump in expenditures is larger than between 25-26 and 26-27 is because there's there's some of those one-time needs for FF&E in those years as well. Also, and we're going to talk about within the next coming months or so, we just did the RFP for transportation services, and there's going to be about a $3 million increase in our transportation contract, and so that's also we'll probably start about March, we start talking about fixed costs. And again, that's not for the 24-25 school year, but it's starting for the 25-26 school year, and so that amount is built into that school year and beyond as well for that, starting with the 25 to 2025 to 2028 for that 3-year contract, and all those amounts are factored into those costs as well. And again, this is just the initial. We have the current year on there, so actually once you add in the 28-29, which is actually the 5th year which will be the 5th year in the 24-25 budget, that will put our fund balance right about $3 million. It says $3.4 million if you look at, or 3.4 months in fund balance, but if you add that additional year in, we're slightly above, right at the 3 months in fund balance, which is actually the 5th year for when we start our 24-25 budget planning. Does anyone else have any comments or concerns or suggestions?
One last quick question. What's the weighted interest rate the school is able to earn on its excess fund balance?
I say that again, sorry.
What's the weighted interest rate that you're able to earn on your excess fund balance?
It's about 4.5% right now. What's our interest rate that we're earning on investments?
I still know. We didn't have as much as we usually have this December for whatever reason. People aren't paying quite as quickly.
They're just
It's around
waiting.
5.5.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean that it was about an additional $1 million in interest revenue that we had last year from the previous year, which is nice.
Discussion, we can move on to our next item for open issue and discussion is the consideration of the 2024-2025 budget parameters and priorities. This is an action item. The motion would be a recommendation to the board for approval at the January 8th meeting. Correct? All right. Do I have a motion to do that?
So moved.
Do you have a second? I'll second it so that we can open it up for discussion. Ms. MacArthur?
Sure. Well, thank you. So our budget parameters basically are the overarching guidelines that are kind of guiding, and then our priorities are more specific examples of where we want to make when we're talking about budget additions and reductions for the next year's budget and going forward. But our parameters is the first document. I did have Noel print you out some copies in case you wanted to make notes or have those in front of you. And so our budget parameters, we start out with the preface there because, again, like I was talking about before, we kind of want to know like what our revenue assumptions are before we go talk about then how much money we're going to spend. And so talking about the 5-year model and then our property tax rates that we just had in our assessed valuation, we did have a reassessment year in this year, and our assessed valuation growth was 6.5%. And then, like Tom mentioned earlier, like we are assuming a 3% increase in the 5-year model and going forward. We did have some comments in here that some wording changes, but basically this is similar to what we have seen in previous years for that. But also the last sentence on this page and the top of the next page kind of for the 24-25 fiscal year, our total property tax revenues are about $177 million, and so that when our total operating funds, our total operating revenues at $270 million. So that's basically the number that we want to work within as we're building our budget going forward. And so we have the 6 items then are what we're including as our budget parameters. And again, these are all tied to our CSIP, or our Comprehensive School Improvement Plan goals. And so the first one you can see there, the Board of Education will consider building program and departmental budget requests in a manner that prioritizes student achievement. Again, we always want to make sure student achievement is what we're focusing on going forward. So all the additions and reductions will be reviewed based on the need and equity and align with our CSIP and our district statement of equity. Student achievement is in our CSIP, and that is goal number 3 in our Comprehensive School Improvement Plan. We're going to continue our modified zero-based budget approach for service and supply budgets. So all of our buildings, our building principals, our department leaders, our coordinators all have to develop their service and supply budgets based on a zero-based budget approach, so they're not just rolling forward the money that they have each year. They really have to think about what they have to spend. Of course, you're always going to have to buy paper and pencils and supplies and stuff like that, but you want to, if you have things that are tied to the CSIP or your building level goals that you want to build in for professional development or similar type items, that you're really thinking thoughtfully about how that ties back to your building goals and build that into your zero-based budget going forward. And then 3 and 4 are about salary improvements and employee benefits that we talked about before. Employee recruitment and retention is incorporated into our CSIP goal number 2, And so the Board of Education will consider salary improvements for all employees, including hourly employees, through the budget and negotiation processes, using comparative data locally and statewide. And we want to make sure that we're continuing to put additional money into the teacher salary schedule as well into our hourly salary schedules. And we made it to $15 an hour, which was a goal previously for our hourly schedules, and we're going to want to continue to put I would like to continue to put a dollar on the base of those schedules to make sure that they're remaining competitive with industry standards for our hourly support schedules, like our custodians, our nutrition services, classroom aides, because those are still a lot of the positions that we're seeing that remain open. And then number 5 is the minimum fund balance that we talked about previously. A minimum fund balance of 3 months of expenditures will be reflected in the 5-year model based on current and projected future total revenues and expenditures. And that is in our Comprehensive School Improvement Plan Indicator 1.1b that says that we'll make that minimum fund balance in our 5-year model. And then capital projects budgets will be allocated and prioritized based on guidance from the Long Range Facilities Planning Committee. And we're going to emphasize on growth, safety, and security, ADA compliance, and maintaining existing facilities, and including addressing deferred maintenance needs. And some of that language I know coming out of our Long Range Committee, and we kind of switched gears where the previous, 20 years we've really been focusing on growth, making sure that we're in brick and mortar, and as we're building and keeping up with the growth of our enrollment. Now that our enrollment projections are flattening out, that we want to really make sure that we're addressing deferred maintenance needs of our existing facilities as well. Any other questions or suggestions, concerns on our parameters?
I bet I know what you're going to say. All right, as I look, oh dear, that sounds terrible. As I look at number 3, I know that I appreciate you and I had some conversations about changing some of the language, and I just want to say I really appreciate the changes that you did make. The one discussion point we had, which was number 3, was the beginning teacher salary in the middle of comparable districts. In this competitive environment, is shooting for the middle actually going to help us remain competitive for teachers?
So I have a couple thoughts about that, and that's why I added some data about local and comparative districts, because Columbia is very unique, where we're not like St. Louis or Kansas City, where we have 10 or 15 other school districts that are right next to us within a 30-minute radius, where we could hop from school district to school district because of similar sizes and salaries and those type things. We are in the middle of the state, and so based on information from discussions with the Missouri School Boards Association and other districts, we really need to make sure that we're pulling local, so Boone County data as well. And so when I have a comparison district which is our districts that are similar in size and demographics, but I also have a list of local, which is more of our Boone County and districts, or within 30 minutes, like our Booneville, Jeff City, Fulton, Mexico, those type school districts where we are much higher compared to salaries. And so there's the wording, I can talk about wording, but and then always, the other thing I wanted to say is the highest is not always the best, because in Columbia, we've always prioritized supports, and so you have to think about what kind of ratios you have. Not only your classroom teacher to student ratios, but different things like that. Your student teacher ratios compared to some of our comparison districts are also very low, and so do we want to prioritize having additional supports over the highest salary? Is not always the best salary. So do you want, we could have the higher salaries, but not really, I don't know that that's always best for student achievement. So you want to make sure that you have additional supports in your buildings as well. So somehow there's a balance between salaries. And so my mentor always said, you don't always want to be the highest or the lowest. You want to kind of be in the middle of the pack. And so they're taking all those different data sets, where you're pulling from those different data sets. That's the logic behind how it was created.
I'm pulling at a thing you said maybe 2 years ago here, so I'm sorry to the public about that. I remember we were talking about salary schedules, and I think one thing that you pointed out, and maybe it's not the case anymore now as things have changed for school districts across and people have changed their schedules. But our salary schedule, when it comes to our step increases, I don't remember if you had said that we have more step increases than most, or if it's that the increases within salary going up, we tend to have a little bit higher than other school districts that might have a higher starting pay but lower increases as you continue to stay here.
Right, and so that's when we talk about data points and comparison. We don't always just want to look at starting salary either, because not only is recruiting important, but retention as well. And so when you compare our teacher's salary schedule, for example, to some of our other districts, there's districts that only step to year 15 or year 20, where we step to year 30. And so like you stop getting those step raises, and you get those raises throughout your career, instead of front loading a lot of that. So, and even if you're like looking at some of the, you can have, and the step increases between one year to the next also are important. The way the model salary schedule was designed through a lot of collaborative work years with our teachers union and with our previous administration about pulling, was to make sure that our step increases in the middle of your career, because you're probably not the best at the beginning of their career, and you're really probably not the best at the end of their career, but you're probably best when you're in the middle of your career. And so that's what you want, the raises, that you're getting the largest increases in your step salaries in the middle of your career, and that's also going towards your retirement as well. And so that's was the philosophy behind that, how that salary schedule was created when we did that several years back.
Just an observation. I would agree that the whole package is important to understand, the student-teacher ratio that impacts what a teacher has to deal with every day. But knowing someone just anecdotally who's gone through the process, I would say that CPS does a really bad job of explaining to new teachers those kinds of things. In fact, I'd say the effort is nearly non-existent. And so I think if we believe it's important, then there's probably an opportunity to educate people we're trying to attract and retain, to help them understand what the advantages are of CPS versus other districts, because I don't think we do a very good job of that.
I think that's a great point. And I mean, from someone, who's never been outside of CPS, people probably don't always realize that either. But then if you talk to teachers who have, don't have positions like homeschool communicators or playground supervisors, or the teachers that have to do bus duty and playground duty and lunch duty, that's not a thing in other districts. And so making sure that we know that it's important that we have positions and supports in our district that a lot of other districts may not have.
Wouldn't we want that then listed out in here as a budget parameter? I agree with Paul. I just don't like the word in the middle, even if we put in the upper half. Even if we're 49th out of 100, we're in the upper half. It's not the middle. Middle just sounds bad. But saying, hey, we're shooting to be in that upper tier, as well as providing all of those other supports, because knowing teachers and that, yeah, we can obviously pay them more, that they would take that, but having those other supports, giving them those other supports, if we can't pay them as much as we want to, if we're able to continue to build those in-classroom supports, that, yeah.
I wanted to add that we are revamping our recruitment and retention efforts. As a matter of fact, there will be a plan presented about how in CPS we are going to do that and improve upon that. There are a cadre of about 30 teachers that have been meeting within the last 3 or 4 months to look at what are we doing here. What will it take to recruit and maintain or sustain quality teachers? And based upon what or findings on what the committee is recommending, there are some changes that are coming down our way. But again, unfortunately, we didn't quite have a solid plan. When I came here, there was not a solid plan in there, but we're about to fix that right now.
Right, and like John said, my beef here, I guess I should say, is that it says we're shooting for the middle. I would rather say we remain competitive with comparable districts rather than a specific shooting for the middle, because shooting for the middle, the language just does not sound.
It sounds like our goal is to be mediocre.
Right. That's the best way to put it. That's exactly right.
But you expect exceptional performance.
Right.
Our vision is to be the best in the state.
So I would just ask that we change it to something like remain competitive with, or something like that, rather than shooting for the middle.
We want to be the destination district for teachers in mid-Missouri and across the country.
The best teachers.
Yes. And then also our support staff. I like that we're continuing to, because those are the people that keep the wheels greased. And so continuing to put an emphasis on those folks and remember those folks, because schools are not running without those folks, is good. So.
I'm just thinking out loud. That middle sentence, whether we have the continued movement toward the model salary schedule for teachers will be prioritized. Do we even need the last part of that sentence? Can we just put period and not have?
I'll be honest with you, I would rather that than what it says right now.
Yeah. Because we were talking, I'm just thinking as I go, because we talk about using the comparative data locally and statewide in the first sentence, and then maybe adding another sentence about supports that we have, instead of even trying to put anything about middle or upper half or anything about that.
The only thing I'd say is that if you don't have anything in there, then it's not really a goal, and there's no accountability, or you don't know if you're getting there or not. So if the goal is to be in the top half, but to me, if it's silent, then it doesn't mean anything.
Okay. I'll work on some additional language. Any other suggestions?
I just had a question on a different topic. Limited knowledge, anecdotal conversations, listening about security and building security and concerns about that. My question is, does the district, does the board feel like there are adequate resources to address the security infrastructure needs of the district at a pace that you're comfortable with? And when I hear things like one-time money for expenditures that may have a high level of priority, just makes me ask the question about security investments, and are we on track? Are we where we want to be?
I know that on our secure vestibule work that we've been doing within all of our buildings, we're on our last 3.
So we have 2 contracts. One construction contract's actually going to go to the board on Monday, so we have 2 separate projects, 3 schools in each one. That are the last 6 that we're addressing, so that all 40 plus buildings will have secured vestibule entryways. And so that was the last round of secure vestibules, so that there's the one dozen.
Is that all that's needed?
No, there's other funds that get spent on a recurring basis of making, like when it comes to safety and security equipment, that they utilize on a daily basis to make sure that it's working. Because there are times where, like, yeah, you can change the battery, but as you know, like once a battery's been used for a year, like it's not charging the same way and things of that nature. So those expenses continuing. I know that we are also I'm trying to think about what was said to us in closed session and not in closed session, and trying to.
Well, just the observation. When we've done community surveys in the past, for the last decade or more, obviously security is always high on everyone's list. And so anything that the school board can do to continue to invest in that and make people aware of it, I think it's a good idea on many levels.
So we are investigating ways of hardening our schools, starting middle high schools right now, to make sure that, again, our staff or scholars are more protected. So that is an ongoing investigation. We are also exploring uses of alternative school environments to where scholars that may need some additional supports in social emotional learning could go. So we're in the middle of that. We visited
with a couple of school districts, and we're really pushing in that arena. We're also looking at our behavior matrix to determine, is it really working? That came online, was it last year? And so we're
Coming out of COVID.
coming out of COVID, right? We brought it back online, and so we're at the point now where we're saying, okay, what's really working and what's not. So it's a work in progress. We're not there yet, but we're definitely, it's in our sights.
We have continued to expand our security SRO program as well. That was on hold there for a while, and we brought it back now so that there's at least one officer in all three of our comprehensive high schools. And when we went away from the SRO program, we added our own security individuals in those, and we did not take those away when we added the SROs back as well.
I was mainly just thinking of, one-time expenditure, capital equipment, if there were any needs, or if we've already got that covered. That was kind of the question.
Yes, it's something that we're looking into definitely, what our options are, whether that be metal detectors or some other system in schools as well. And so that could definitely be something that we could use where we could transfer money from our operating fund over to our capital projects fund to be able to make those one-time purchases.
On that topic, does the school utilize, third parties to do like a security assessment on the school, on individual buildings, and look at it and say, this is a vulnerable point, this is something that you should look to improve, this is what other districts have done? Yeah, so Chief of Security does that on a yearly basis. They look to determine sort of areas of need, and again, that is continuous. Always looking to see how they can improve and, harden, again, what the schools are doing right now. Again, it's a work in progress because, things are changing. Oh my gosh, as we look at discipline within our schools and what's happening, around, it's changing, it's evolving. And our community values, what's happening in our community will find their way into the schools. And we know what's going on in our community and how that's changing. So now schools, we have to adapt to that and be prepared and deal with that in such a way where our environment is a safe environment. So yes, we have work to do, absolutely.
Some specific concrete examples was after Parkway and Uvalde, our chief of security, that was John White at the time still, once those reports came out on just evaluating the situation, he did in-depth review of those reports, and from that took suggestions and began to instruct our principals and buildings to change kind of some of the practices that we had in response to like what worked or didn't work in Parkway at the time, not Parkway, right, Uvalde and Parkway. So yeah.
And training is a big deal. Our director of security, our department also partners with the National Threat Assessment, some programming there where they do that they get a programming. Also they do training, do that as well, because it doesn't matter how many multi-million-dollar security systems you have. If someone's opening a back door, there's no, if there's one entrance and you're still using 10 entrances to get in the building. And so just making sure, because that's a whole process and procedure type thing too, to make sure that we're training our building and department leaders so that on different security things as well. Okay, I want to flip over to our budget goals and priorities, and this is kind of a more detailed list of what different things that we want to focus on as we're building our budget for the 24-25 school year. Again, 80% of our expenditures come from salaries and benefits, so any improvements to compensation is going to be the largest driver of any budget implications. And so our number one on the list is improved compensation for all employees. That's going to touch all of our students, it's touch all of our employees, all employee groups, to continue with specific increases, not only step increases, but improvements to schedules for all of our employees. And again, that's tied to our CSIP goal number 2 for employee recruitment and retention. Same thing for number 2 there for fully paid medical, dental, and life insurance for all of our full-time employees. Number 3 is support of quality curriculum. Again, this is directly tied to our student achievement, which is our CSIP goal number 3. We want to make sure that we have quality curriculum, and curriculum cycles are prioritized throughout the 5-year model, and one-time spends or multi-year spends as we're implementing new curriculum. And as we were just talking about, number 4 is one that looks a little different than it has in previous years, but we do continue to prioritize social emotional needs in the 24-25 school year through the addition of FTE like school counselors and behavior support specialists. But also it's important that we're having training and de-escalation techniques to reduce overall behavior incidents. And the board also supports non-traditional programming going forward for students who need that additional support, including things like alternative school models.
Are these in any particular order?
No.
Okay. I wanted to ask, just I wanted to make sure. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I don't want to be the one that tries to prioritize. I do usually put compensation first because that does affect everybody from, throughout.
That one I would expect, but then everything else
Yes.
after that, I'm like, okay.
John, that was actually my top question there too, so yeah,
No.
it's all good.
No. I mean, I can prioritize it based on how much money it costs, but it's not my job to prioritize it compared to, what's most important.
So maybe half joking, but half not. I mean, I look at this list and my question is, what's not a priority? So it's almost like if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority.
So, well, yes, but
Or these are just all the initiatives that are supported by the strategic plan, and
right, and
they're
it's
just what we're
like, so when we focus on what budget additions and reductions, and honestly, jokingly, some stuff was cut out of here because that's not maybe as closely related to student achievement or like our goals, like with increasing test scores and those types of things. Some we could add positions that, might not touch, the things that we wanted to touch. And so as we went through this list, we really did try. I mean, yes, there's a lot of things on here, but yet there's also, tried to tie it back to somehow to our strategic plan so that we are thinking about, student achievement and our recruitment and retention efforts to make sure that that's at the forefront of our budget document as well. And the next two have to do with, the growing populations of, we had special education, but also exceptional students as well. That was a different terminology that we had so that we're more encompassing through additional support staff and service and supply increases. We know English language, our population of our EL students has exploded over the last couple of years, and so even in the current year, we don't have enough teaching staff. Our class sizes are way above what they should be for our EL students, and so making sure that we're continuing to add in special education and EL. Both are some of the hardest positions to recruit as well, so we want to make sure that those are priorities in our budget going forward as well.
And just to be clear, whenever you say exceptional students, you're not just talking about gifted students, you're talking about students with various needs, including gifted, special ed, 504, and that. I just want to make that clear that whenever we talk about exceptional,
Yes.
we're talking about beyond the average,
Yes,
basically.
and that is a Department of Elementary and Secondary Education definition, not a definition that Heather MacArthur created on her own. So we want to make sure that we're inclusive from an equity perspective as well. Early childhood also is as a population that we know we have lots of kids on the waiting list, and we're seeing decreases in our kindergarten readiness, and that we're wanting to make sure that we're focusing on our early childhood education, including our early childhood special education, to make sure that we're improving, that we're getting kids ready even before the K-12 spectrum. Workforce development has also been a big thing over the last couple of years in support not only of elective offerings in the regular secondary environment for secondary school students, but also through increasing programming at the Columbia Area Career Center to promote that workforce development initiatives district-wide. Title I, support of additional resources and support of emerging systems at Title I Elementary. Our Title I funding only goes to elementary schools, and so we want to make sure that we know that all of our secondary schools are, there's higher needs at certain schools compared to other schools as well, even though Title I funding right now is not spent, and so that's why we say Title I eligible middle schools and high schools, to make sure those are prioritized through additional resources at those schools. And also that the board that will strive to make sure those class sizes, and we would do class sizes at our schools, but to make sure those class sizes at our Title I buildings or Title I eligible buildings are below the maximum recommended class sizes by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education as well.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes.
Right now, do we have any, are those schools, are they above the recommended class sizes right now?
No, I mean, we try to, when we do projections, I mean, sometimes projecting is not, our numbers don't always come in exactly but when we do projections, we do always lean towards trying to make sure that we have the lower class sizes at our Title I elementary schools. So when we're doing projections, we have it broken down for our elementary specifically by grade and by section at each school. We all know that our Title I elementary schools is also where our highest mobility exists.
Right.
And so sometimes they may go, we try to, our recommended levels are below what DESE the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education maximums are. So we try to shoot for a class size of 23 or less for K through 2 and a class size of 26 or less for 3 through 5. That being said, if we enroll 3 students at Blue Ridge Elementary School and they go over, the class size in November, it's not realistic to say we're going to add a section and split and reorganize kids in the middle of the school year either. So usually when that happens, then we try to add an additional classroom aide or instructional aide or paraprofessional or some other additional support in that building to be able to help manage the class sizes. That makes sense. Technology continues to be device equity across all of our buildings, and also to make sure that we have the technology staffing to be able to support all of our technology needs as well. Human resources and our recruitment and retention efforts, we've touched on that several times tonight. We know that we need to make sure that we're continuing to expand our recruitment and retention efforts, and that has may be done through additional staffing through our human resources department. And then the 5-year model plans for our operating budgets for one-time purchases like we talked about on our 5-year model, with the operating costs for the opening of the new schools for the Southwest Elementary School, as well as addition projects throughout our 5-year model, and then addressing that deferred maintenance and other capital-related needs as we're having capital projects, making sure that we have the associating operating budgets to be able to support those capital projects, and addressing our older facility needs with a safety and security, ADA, and deferred maintenance as well.
I keep on coming back to what Tom shared. And so I guess one thing, and I'm just, not everyone I think knows this, I just got done doing a 12-hour drive from Alabama, so I'm not going to explain this well, in some ways, our priorities are the CSIP goals. And a way of framing this document is that this document, as it is attached, we highlight which CSIP goal it's related to. This document just provides specific definitions of how we're reaching those priorities.
Correct.
Okay. And the reason why I say this is because I was just thinking about, Tom, as you said, like if all of these are priorities, like if all 13 of these more specifically defined items are priorities, like not all can be, right? And so I just didn't know if that maybe in like the way that the board talks about this and is a administrative team too with us in our community is really being about like our budget priorities are our CSIP goals. But those three CSIP goals, that are the budget priorities. This document here of like budget goals and priorities breaks it down a little bit more and gives specifics of how we're working towards that with the budget.
Correct. And I mean,
I like
not
that.
to be silly, but I mean, we didn't, I could say like I needed an assistant or something. I mean, obviously we didn't just put anything or everything, on the list, or we wanted to add additional administration or something that wasn't, related to something, one of our overarching goals.
This just outlines how we're paying for the CSIP.
Correct. Where we're putting
we're
our
gonna
money,
pay for
how
those.
our budget and how we're spending our money relates back to our continuous improvement plan. Correct. Yes.
Yeah, it could be a few sentences just to make that clear, because in that context makes more sense, like, okay, this is the implementation of the strategic plan as it plays out in the budget. So this is not the end of something on its own, but it's part of this bigger thing.
Any further discussion or questions?
Do we need to approve whatever language that we're changing
Well, that,
before we action item it?
I was about to go into that and see where we felt. So we're in action item of making a recommendation. I know that we've shared some specific language. Heather has said that she's going to kind of look at what she can do to craft it and getting into that space. And so I guess that's where here, this is more like a straw poll to see where we would want to go. We could go into very specifics, right, and vote on each kind of verbiage, or we could kind of generally go into that space of voting and saying that we're going to be making a recommendation for the board to approve this with the change, pending changes drafted by Heather in relation to the budget parameters items that we discussed and what we just discussed here with the budget goals and priorities.
So I would need to pull my motion or withdraw my motion.
You
To
could amend
approve
it,
or
or
amend
I
it.
think we would just have to amend
Amend
it to state that. I want to make sure though that everyone, we're clear on what at least those things are, Heather, that you're looking at. So would you mind summarizing what you have written down for yourself?
Yes. So under the budget parameters document, in goal number, or in the parameter number 3, I'm taking out the part of the middle of the pack and prioritizing the upper part of our comparison districts and adding an additional part about providing supports. And then I think in the overall, for the budget goals and priorities document, adding a sentence before we go into the each bullet point about how these budget goals and parameters supports the CSIP goals.
I should just do thumbs up because people don't know what that means on the live. But is everyone good with that? Do they feel like anything's being missed or anything from that? All right, so I move to amend the motion to reflect adding those things that Heather just shared, allowing Heather to craft the specific language.
Second.
Any discussion on that amendment? I really don't feel like we should be wordsmithing here and letting Heather to do what she needs to do to get the words right. So I totally support what you just said. All right. If there's no further discussion, what we'll first be voting on is just the amendment. And then after we vote on the amendment, whether it passes or fails, we'll move into then voting on the motion itself. So all those in favor of approving the amendment to the motion to allow Heather to make those changes that she summarized for us that we did discuss here, please raise your hand and say aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, unanimously approved, adopted the amendment. Moving on to the amended motion. Any further discussion? All right, the amended motion on the table is to recommend the 2024-2025 budget parameters and goals and priorities to the board for approval with the amendments that we gave today. Any question about that motion that's on the table? All right, I'll call it for a vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, unanimously approved for recommendation for approval to the board. With that, I will go ahead and motion to adjourn. Is there a second? Second. All right, all those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, we are adjourned at 5:48. Thank you all so much.